Hello again. I love this picture. If you can't read it, it says, well, of course you can read it, you've got the PowerPoints, but it says constipation. It brings out the worst in all of us, and I'm sure everybody can relate. So let's talk about some drugs that will make it a little bit easier to excrete the things that we need to excrete. So on page 253, we start talking about drugs for both constipation and diarrhea. Oh, goody. For some reason, this lecture always seems to be before lunch, so hopefully we're not there. But what we want out of our laxatives is to help us get rid of stool from the rectum, to draw fluid into the intestine, and to get feces through the colon in a timely manner. Generally speaking, we know that our colon is mostly used for the reabsorption of water, leaving behind solid material that needs to be excreted. And it can be extremely uncomfortable if it needs to be excreted and can't. So if too much water is taken, the stools can get very dry and refuse to be excreted. And if we don't take up water fast enough, then we end up with diarrhea, but that's another subject. So right now we're going to talk about 5 types of laxatives that you might choose to take if you've got this particular problem. On page 254 in your book, we have a memory jogger that consider signs and symptoms of constipation. Now, there are people, and you've probably run into them in your job, who think that if you do not have a bowel movement every day that you are constipated, and that's not necessarily the truth. Everybody has their own particular bowel pattern. Some people will go almost every time they eat, and then other people won't go for 2 or 3 days. So constipation is more considered the discomfort, hard stools, feeling like you're bloated and you still have material in your colon even after a bowel movement. On page 257 to 259, we have drugs for both diarrhea and constipation, and unfortunately they kind of they do the diarrhea drugs first and then the constipation drugs. So we start with the laxatives at the bottom of page 257. I know that's confusing, and we'll go back and look at drugs for diarrhea a little bit later. Make sure that you read box 13.4 on page 256, nursing considerations for our patients who have constipation, because they are miserable. They're miserable and they're going to be crabby. So we're going to talk about 5 different categories. We've got bulk forming agents, fecal softeners, saline solutions or solutions that are hyperosmolar, a lubricant, and then stimulant or irritant laxatives. And you can probably look at each one of those names and figure out how they work and how they encourage bowel movements, but we're going to go through anyway. So at the bottom of page 257, we talk about our bulk forming laxatives. These absorb water in the stool, and that allows the stool to expand. The moisture content of the stool is increased. The stool becomes softer. The more water and stool that is in the colon, the more uncomfortable we get. Peristalsis increases, and then the stool is easier to be passed. If you look on the bottom of page 257, we see that bulk forming drugs come in a variety of names, and they can be gotten over the counter. The main categories or the generic terms for these drugs that are shown are methylcellulose and psyllium, or some people say psyllium. I don't know if you recognize these 2 products, but they're both plant materials. They're materials found in plants. Plants have cellulose that helps them absorb fluid, and so that plant product can be treated and ground up and put into a powder that when it goes into our colon, it does not get digested. Instead, it absorbs water. Same with psyllium. So we've got methylcellulose. An example of this is Citracel. And then psyllium, fibrol, metamucil. So generally, they're powder or in a little packet, and you mix them with water, stir, drink, and that's going to help the amount of fluid that's in your colon. The next category, if you flip over to page 258, we've got fecal softeners, also go by the name emollients or stool softeners. The stool softener is probably what we as nurses call them most often. That lowers the surface tension on the outside of the fecal mass. Feces has a mucus coating that can sometimes prevent fluid from getting in, and if we decrease that coating on the surface, that allows more water in, so it doesn't just remain in the intestine, it softens up the stool. And you all are probably familiar with the most common stool softener, docusate, also known as Colace. Little red gel type tablets. Colace is the prescription brand, but you can buy stool softeners, over the counter, no problem, a lot cheaper. And it does not act as a laxative unless you just take way too many of them. It just makes the fecal mass softer and easier to pass. Probably one of the categories we're also familiar with as nurses is the next category, which are hyperosmolar laxatives. So they have usually a greater amount of sodium. And remember, sodium, water follows sodium. So there's going to be some kind of a substance that is going to draw water, usually saline. So that produces what is known as an osmotic effect by drawing water into the bowel. And so that makes the bowel very liquid. It irritates the GI tract, so peristalsis begins, and it encourages bowel movement. They often use these in the clinical setting to prepare your colon before various kinds of testing. If you go to have a colonoscopy, they're going to give you a whole lot of hyperosmolar laxative in a couple different forms, and mostly with saline in it to draw in what feels like all the water from your body and everybody else's body too, because it makes your stool absolutely liquid and just washes it out. So it cleans the GI tract out before procedures, and it also gets rid of barium if a patient should pass it after testing. Barium swallows and barium enemas are given if they want to really be able to well visualize the GI tract during testing. It kind of lights up. And so if it doesn't get passed and it's allowed to sit in the colon and harden, it can become very hard to get rid of. So a hyperosmolar laxative will be very effective in getting rid of that, especially for our patients who are a little bit older. Lubricant laxatives. I don't even, let's see, oh yeah, page 259. Glycerin suppositories are one lubricant laxative that's talked about, and it creates a barrier between the colon and the feces. It kind of makes an oily barrier so that the water does not get reabsorbed into the colon. Instead, it's there softening up the stool, and that makes things a little bit easier to pass. So page 259 shows glycerin suppositories inserted into the rectum and just sort of coats the lining of that colon and allows the stool to soften. And then stimulant or irritant laxatives, they do exactly what they say they do. They irritate the colon. That makes the nerves a little bit more touchy, peristalsis increase, because there's increased movement or motility in the GI tract. There is more water to be passed, and so sometimes you'll end up with cramping and a more liquid stool.